The Veblen Effect is a social behavioral mechanism in which wealth turns into appearance rather than need. So why do people in materially wealthy societies feel poorer? This question touches not only individual psychology, but also how power is perceived, how value is measured, and how time operates on human beings. Because in any system where people define their place through the gaze of others, a hidden gap emerges between the feeling of abundance and the feeling of poverty. And although this gap has taken different forms throughout history, it has never lost its essence. Throughout history, human societies have not moved solely from hunger to satiety or from poverty to prosperity. They have also moved from being seen to being invisible, from being distinguished to being overlooked. And this second axis has often been more powerful than the first, because once physical needs are met, social needs enter the stage. And these needs operate not through material logic, but through symbolic logic, where the central question is not how much you have, but among whom you have it and what exactly it is. At different stages of history, being wealthy has never carried the same meaning. In feudal societies, land ownership signified power. During the industrial era, control over the means of production was considered superiority. But in the modern world, wealth has increasingly taken on a form that is visible, displayed, and fed by the attention of others, transforming it from a static condition into a dynamic race, because everything that is visible is compared, and everything that is compared generates competition. This is precisely where Thorstein Veblen Effect's central insight lies. Consumption is used not merely to satisfy needs, but to silently construct social hierarchy. And this hierarchy is reinforced not by laws, but by gazes, gestures, and everyday choices. What a person wears, where they live, how they speak, and what they consider ordinary reflects less their economic position than how they perform that position. And this performance arises not so much from the desire to prove oneself to others as from the fear of falling behind the level of others. At this point, wealthy countries turn into a paradoxical stage because as overall prosperity rises, minimum standards also rise, and what was considered luxury yesterday becomes normal today. Everything that becomes normal ceases to create status, and what creates no status loses its psychological value, leading people to feel subjectively poorer, despite objectively having more, because the reference point of comparison has shifted. States are not outside this process, because economic power is not measured solely by macro indicators, but also by how citizens perceive their place within the system. A country may be technically wealthy, but if that wealth turns into visible and accessible status markers for large segments of society, psychological poverty deepens, because people compare their lives not with the past but with those beside them, and this line of comparison never saturates upward. The relationship between money and time further strengthens this mechanism, because while income growth creates a one-time sense of relief, expectations are continuously pushed forward. And human psychology focuses not on what has been attained, but on what is believed should be attained, turning economic development into not an end point, but a constantly receding line, so that increases in prosperity do not translate into increases in happiness, but merely accelerate the pace of competition. Thus, the concept of modern poverty separates from physical deprivation and moves into a symbolic realm, where the central issue is not lacking possessions, but the feeling of falling behind. And this feeling is nourished more by social signals than by real shortages. Because the human brain's perception of threat is more sensitive to the fear of exclusion than to hunger. And losing status often has a more destabilizing effect than losing resources. Understanding this landscape is not possible by looking solely at consumption habits, because the issue runs deeper than individual choices. It concerns how historically formed power structures seep into everyday life, and the more invisible this seepage is, the more powerful it becomes, because even when individuals feel free, their behavior is silently guided. And it is precisely these silent mechanisms that begin to explain why a pervasive sense of poverty exists within modern wealthy societies. As this symbolic form of poverty takes hold, it reshapes everyday behavior in ways that often remain unnoticed, because the pressure it creates does not come from deprivation, but from proximity, from constantly living close enough to higher standards to see them clearly, yet far enough away to never fully reach them. In such environments, inequality does not need to be extreme to be psychologically powerful. It only needs to be visible. Repeated and normalized through daily exposure, turning comparison into a background process that quietly frames how individuals assess their own worth. This is why the architecture of modern wealth matters as much as its distribution, because cities, media, and digital platforms compress social distance, placing radically different lifestyles side by side within the same visual field. When luxury apartments rise next to modest housing, when curated lives flow endlessly through screens, wealth stops being an abstract statistic and becomes a lived reference point. And once wealth becomes a reference point rather than a goal, it begins to function as a measuring stick for identity rather than security. In this setting, consumption no longer signals comfort, but alignment, a way of demonstrating that one belongs to a certain rhythm of life, a certain tempo of spending, a certain aesthetic of normality. The pressure is not to survive, but to keep up. And keeping up is a moving target, because the standards that define adequacy are set not by necessity, but by the upper edges of what is socially visible. As those edges advance, the middle feels perpetually insufficient, even when material conditions objectively improve. This dynamic reveals why economic growth alone struggles to resolve feelings of lack, because growth expands capacity without stabilizing meaning. When incomes rise across a society, expectations rise alongside them, not evenly, but hierarchically, following the same gradients of visibility and status that shaped inequality before growth occurred. The result is a treadmill effect, where progress changes the scenery, but not the sensation of effort, leaving individuals running harder while feeling no closer to rest. What makes this mechanism particularly resilient is that it operates through aspiration rather than coercion. No one is forced to desire status markers, yet opting out carries social costs that are subtly but persistently reinforced. To dress differently, to live more modestly, or to disengage from visible competition risks misinterpretation. Because deviation from the norm is often read not as choice but as failure, turning conformity into a form of psychological insurance against judgment. Over time, this transforms how people relate to their own achievements, because satisfaction becomes conditional, dependent not on what has been attained, but on how that attainment compares within a shifting social frame. Success loses its capacity to settle into contentment, as each milestone immediately repositions the individual within a new field of comparison, where previous gains dissolve into baseline expectations. In this way, abundance feeds dissatisfaction, not by reducing resources, but by eroding finality. The deeper consequence is a gradual internalization of scarcity, even in environments of plenty, where individuals learn to experience security as temporary and status as fragile. This internalization shapes financial behavior, encouraging risk-taking to maintain position, overwork to justify standing, and consumption patterns aimed less at enjoyment than at signaling stability. The economy, in turn, absorbs these behaviors, reinforcing cycles of production and display that depend on sustained feelings of insufficiency to function smoothly. At a societal level, this creates a paradox where stability relies on unease, because systems built around continuous growth and visible differentiation require a population that never fully feels complete. The fear is not collapse, but stagnation, not hunger, but irrelevance, and this fear quietly aligns individual motivation with structural demands, ensuring participation without overt enforcement. In such conditions, modern wealth does not eliminate poverty. It redefines it into a persistent sense of being behind, even while moving forward. As this logic deepens, it becomes increasingly difficult to distinguish personal desire from social pressure, because both speak the same language of improvement and self-optimization. The pursuit of a better life merges seamlessly with the pursuit of a more acceptable image, and the boundary between genuine aspiration and reactive comparison fades. What remains is a form of poverty that cannot be solved by redistribution alone, because its source lies not only in access to resources, but in the meanings attached to them. This is the terrain where the Veblen Effect fully unfolds, not as a marginal curiosity of luxury markets, but as a central organizing principle of modern economic life, shaping how value is experienced, how success is judged, and why societies that grow richer can simultaneously feel more strained. The story does not end with consumption itself, but with the psychological environment consumption creates, an environment where enough is rarely enough, and where wealth, once visible, ceases to reassure, and instead begins to demand constant reaffirmation.